In the morning, I told the people that were coming in that if you want to get rich, you must learn to come to the front. In the future, you might get a lot of money and a lot of stuff if you sit in the front. All right? No, sorry. We are getting ready to move forward with the next session. I hope we all had a meal and something to drink, and we are ready to get started. Thank you so much for coming. Can I ask the colleagues at the back to bring the microphones, please? Yes, thank you. We're going to have a panel. Thank you. You can put them here on the chairs. Tomorrow we'll try and talk to the people the caterers to maybe create 2 queues so that we can move a bit faster. Or queues on both sides of the thing, just to speed up the queuing. I think we have enough people to get started. And we were talking earlier on about mineral resources in some of the countries where the companies would go. They don't care that it's dangerous or whatever the case may be. They are malicious. Now, for those of you who have come early, I might just have rare earth minerals to give you before the day is over. All right. I'm now going to introduce the next session and the speakers or the panel that is going to participate. The high-level panel on financing for sustainable development. Colleagues, I think we all know that Africa is lagging behind on the implementation of sustainable development. I don't think we're the only continent, but we're talking about us now. And so we've got to reimagine partnerships and financing models for Africa's sustainable future. How do we fund Africa's future such that it becomes sustainable? How do we do this? And so the moderator that you have on your program unfortunately got stuck somewhere in Switzerland, couldn't make it. And so I will step in for him. But I'm happy to tell you that we have our eminent speakers, Dr. George Kararach. He is a lead economist at the Africa Development Bank. Doc, welcome. Let's give him a round of applause, please. Thank you. Thank you, sir. You can take a seat over there. Doc, Brian and myself were on another panel last week. It seems like we are in the same events more often. We were talking about this issue of sovereign, no, it was not sovereign wealth. Yeah, it was sovereign wealth funds. And he shared some incredible points there. I think you said something like five, some.
Oh, my 7 eyes.
7 eyes, yeah. I still have them. It's always good to alliterate because it's easy to remember. And the next speaker is Mr. Jamil Karim. He is a partner at Africa International Advisors, South Africa. Let's give him a round of applause. Yeah. Thank you so much. Gentlemen, I'm not an expert at all in this field, so I'd rather stay here and just shoot questions towards you. And basically, the topic of our discussion is reimagining partnerships. Just let's start with you, Jamil. Can you just share with us your thoughts on this topic? What came to your mind as you were thinking about how do we fund sustainability, Africa's sustainable future, in such a way that we can leapfrog the development of the continent? Can we? All right. Working. There's another one. Yeah. See if that one is working. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Program Director, and good afternoon, colleagues, and thank you for the opportunity to be part of this panel. I think the concept of partnership is an incredibly important one, particularly, well, globally, but particularly in the African context, right? I think when looking at Africa, if we go back in history, and unfortunately, the way the global economy has historically engaged with the African continent has often been quite in favor of one party, has been particularly extractive in nature in certain instances, and the consequences were left behind, right? So unfortunately, through history, there has been many instances of the global economy or global capital privatizing the gains and socializing the losses in Africa. And the only way in which we could meaningfully address that is, if you want to create a structural outcome, you need to take a structural approach to addressing that outcome. And I think, it is very difficult in the African context to be very singular in terms of the way we interpret the economy or economic development or economic prosperity without taking a sort of broader view, thinking about the interplay of politics, thinking about the interplay of society. So I think that there are many players and many partners in this ecosystem, and the concept of partnership is very broad, right? But what does it mean when we actually think about how we bring it together in an economic paradigm of sorts? You're seeing that culminate in the likes of new innovative financing structures, public-private partnerships, blended finance, concessional finance. So that's really, when I was thinking about this topic and I was thinking about how partners come together, the key is what do we want to achieve and who are all the role players that play a part and beneficiate in the achievement of those outcomes. So that's really what I thought.
Okay, thank you so much. I like the way that you phrased it, where you're talking about privatizing the gains and socializing the losses. Wow, that's a powerful phrase there. Thank you so much for your inputs on this issue. Doc, I have already indicated that many of the countries on the continent are struggling on this issue of sustainability, and even on the issue of the Africa Agenda 2063. So maybe you've thought about how we can, maybe your response to this topic of sort of future proofing the sustainability of our continent. How do we do this?
Okay. So
and tell us, what is the Africa Development Bank doing
So let me have a disclaimer there then. I'm going to speak on my own behalf. I think the ADB is doing quite a lot, actually, to be honest. I have a 10-page summary of the kind of stuff we are doing.
Okay.
But you need to come to one of our business operation seminars one of these days to have a sense of the various financing instruments that we do. But the essence of all of this is actually, I kind of broke it down into 3 elements, the element of sustainability. So the first is on supporting innovative financing and investment instruments. And there are quite a number of them these days, although sometimes Africa doesn't get quite a bit of that chunk. Investing in green finance, for example. I think we get close to just about 3%, if I'm not wrong, the continent, on climate financing.
Sorry, Joe. So, can you hear him at the back there? Okay.
So I'm saying, yeah,
Yes.
I think, well, without the mic, I'm loud enough. But anyway, so a huge chunk of that, of climate finance, is not actually coming on the continent. So we were at the G20, there were a lot of this conversation on the green, on the just energy transition. And I think the emphasis there was on the just element, because you can be saying you need to move away from hydrocarbons and so on without the element of the justice, because it has implications for things like employment and loss of jobs and so on. I remember we went to, it was in the Northern Cape, I believe, where we saw this massive solar, it's actually, yeah, solar energy
farms.
plant, the solar farms, yeah. And Guadamatashe was there, and we were all talking energy transition. And I remember him saying, but you guys are saying, and this is just before the elections, huh? And he said, but you guys are saying we need to move away from using coal as a basis for our energy security. And how quickly do you want us to move? You don't seem to be saying, but you seem to be suggesting that we should do it now without the money coming on the table, how that can be done quickly. There were numbers that were being floated around. I don't know, for the continent, I think it was $7 billion or something, dollars or something like that. And so his question was, we are going into an election. Are you guys suggesting regime change without really saying it? or what is it that you are saying? So financing, climate finance is quite important. But that links to the issue of partnership, because I think that our countries really need partners. Now, if you want me to give you an example of the bank, we, for example, are participating in the so-called, let me rephrase it, in the African Financial Alliance on Climate Change, which is actually is a facility for giving green finance, and we are trying to climate-proof projects, for example, to make sure that that get locked in. But we're also working a lot with countries to ramp up domestic resource mobilization, and a huge chunk of that again is going into things like infrastructure and so on. And you must have heard when we were sitting around the G20 conversations last week, right? Yeah. It was clear that majority of our infrastructure are actually funded domestically, a huge chunk of it. But we also need reforms in the way the global financial architecture works, because a lot of it is also not in favor in the continent, as he suggested. Part of it is linked to the issue of risk perception. I'm not too sure that Africa is much more riskier than other parts of the world, but the impression that you get, and I think now rating agencies have started to accept that there was actually a misnomer or a misrepresentation of the level of risk that the continent itself actually faces. And so the reforms that we need is not just domestic policy reforms, but we also need to reform the way the global financial architecture works. Recently, it was 2 years ago now, the IMF issued special drawing rights, SDRs. These are like credits, coupons, if you want to call it that. But the majority of that actually went to countries that don't need it. And so our push from the ADB was to say, why do you have to issue these cushions to countries that don't really need them? Why don't you actually issue that to us and to the continent? And if you are worried about governance issues, you can give it to us. We are a credit, AAA rated bank. So if you are worried about that the money will not be managed properly, you might as well give it to us, and then we will manage it on your behalf for the utilization of the African continent. So the issues around reforming the international financial architecture, this actually should be at the table. And I think the theme of the G20 on solidarity speaks well to that if you really are saying that you are standing with us, then give us the resources. You don't need it, why do you have to hoard it in the first instance? And so the conversation around rechanneling the SDRs, I think, are still on. I think we are still trying to persuade the rest of the world that the ADB is the right place to put those monies, and we should do that. But we also have another initiative that we were actually working with the African Union, the so-called African Financial Stability Mechanism. You might not have heard about it. So we are trying to set up a facility which will help countries that are in distress or in the imminent threat of that distress, to make sure that these resources then are available for them to actually for stabilizing their fiscuses. Now, but beyond of that, you also, I think majority of you are in civil society. I think that you can work outside of the populace. So building local capacity, including in civil society, is part of that conversation about sustainability, because you need to strengthen financial management systems or governance systems. And I have tended to say that the problem with the issue of debt in Africa is a governance problem, not just from the way debts are contracted, but also how those resources are actually managed. We don't really know how our ministries of finance sign billions of dollars worth of debt. They don't explain to you how this debt will be repaid, or what time span, the terms and conditions, and so forth and so forth. In a democratic context, those are things that should be publicly discussed or debated. And that links, for example, to the conversation we are having on sovereign wealth funds. If you are borrowing today and we are paying in 50 years' time, then issues of intergenerational responsibility, it's important. It's a concept that we need to appreciate. Are we getting our children and grandchildren in debt way before they are born, and without their voice on how these monies were used? Those are democratic questions that need to be answered. And so, you know, it's a conversation I think that civil society should pay great attention to. I bump into Dr. Kabambe outside. Okay. And he might have not told you about issues around the resource-backed loans, for example. There are many countries that have taken loans in exchange for resources, or loans for infrastructure. A lot of that has been happening, where they're borrowing for things that have not been dug out of the earth, right? Resource-backed loans. So how that does work? So countries go and borrow in the name of Uganda's fund oil, let's say, right? So we go and borrow money from, let's say, China or the US or wherever, and say, in exchange, when we start producing that oil, we'll give you our oil to pay you back, right? Now, the problem with most of those facilities is that they're not transparent. So again, the issue of accountability, transparency, and asking the right questions to make sure that you get value for money is important, because debt in itself is not necessarily a bad thing.
Okay.
But you need to be sure that the money borrowed is actually used for productive investments, right? So if you do that right, it shouldn't be a problem. But if you do not do it right, then it is an issue. And that links to the issue of sustainability. That sustainability implies that you are in a position to pay back, but it also requires you to grow. It requires that the money is invested correctly, and you have the correct public financial management systems. There are many countries that don't even probably have, they may have the act to manage, that guides the management of the resources, but the enforcement of how the act is applied may also be a problem. So issues around capacity building goes beyond the traditional boundaries of the Ministry of Finance and may include civil society. So I'm trying to have a sense of the audience that are sitting here, that you have a role in ensuring that sustainability is not something that sits in the Ministry of Finance or sits in the central bank. You have a role to also play in that, because you can all, you are representatives accountable, whether they are borrowing the money or whether they are using resources that are being extracted. So the issues of sovereign wealth funds, for example, yes, some of them are savings, intergenerational savings, but some of them, the resources could be exploited and used now. But use how is important, and who accountable will be an important element.
We'll cycle back to you, Doc, because you've mentioned quite a lot of issues, starting from, things like, for example, coal versus the need for, energy transition. How do we deal with that? You've mentioned issues of debt. You've mentioned debt sustainability, innovation, investing, and so forth. Now, I just want to come back to you, Mr. Karim, from your perspective, if you can maybe want to comment on what the doctor is saying. So if you're going to fund, what partnerships models need to be in place for us to finance this? So do we go to private sector? Do we go to investors outside of the country? Or the continent? Do we look at FDIs? What do we do? What models can you think of that we need to look into? And how do we balance that with this issue of debt that we already owe?
Yeah, I think the doc raised a number of profound points, and I was actually making notes on a few of them, which I think I'll be able to at least cover in my response. Doc, you mentioned something which I thought was incredibly pertinent around mispricing African risk, and that potentially, Africa is, in many instances, not as risky as others would certainly perceive it to be. And I think that's a really important point, right? Because I think part of the issue we have around debt serviceability and the high cost of debt is because the risk profile of Africa is not really very well understood. And in many instances, that is frankly a consequence of a lack of data, or a lack of, or consequence of information asymmetry, which may exist. How do you price the risk of something if you don't truly understand it, right? Now, I just want to, maybe give an example of that, right? I had the benefit of attending a conference in the US in the past month. And I mean, when you visit the US, you recognize why the US is the proportion of the global economy that it is. It's significant, it's very, very active, it's consumer driven. However, don't be mistaken into thinking that everything just works perfectly, right? You will be amazed that there are a lot of things that work incredibly well, but when you come back to South Africa, you actually do realize, and I mean, the doc will correct me if I'm wrong, I'm comparing a country, South Africa, which is roughly about 0.3% of global GDP, to a country that's about 25% of global GDP. The ability to process a payment here is so much quicker, right? I had, my luggage didn't arrive when I did. It came a few days later. And I'm still battling with the airline to get a refund. In South Africa, that would be a lot, the processes are a lot quicker. So it's a simple example, right? One of the things that is often misunderstood is this concept of scale, right? So we know that one of the underlying drivers of the economics of business is, particularly in the likes of technology or otherwise, is this concept of scale. I can't think of a continent that presents a better scale opportunity than Africa, right? However, if you look at how scale is achieved in the very conventional sense, I think you don't truly appreciate the nuances that sit within the African context, right? So, can you, if you were a supermarket and you wanted to, for example, let me rather actually use a real example that we came across with one of our clients. If you take the fiber line market in South Africa, right? Some may argue that it's actually very concentrated. However, if you break it down across the LSM spread, what you will find is it's very concentrated at the higher LSM. So if you have a fiber line to your house, chances are you're not going to be shopping for another fiber line to your house. However, as you step down the LSM sort of spectrum, you'll find that there's massive dislocations in the market. Now, the difficulty is how do you get that last mile out to the users? And there's such fascinating models that organizations are looking at, going back to this concept of partnership, where, in the past there was the sense that, well, if you were to roll it out to a township, how do you manage the infrastructure? How do you, secure the infrastructure? Because it's a very one-dimensional question that you're asking, right? The better question to ask is, when we go into this community, how do we collectively own this asset with this community? Bring the community into the ownership and management of the asset. Let them be let them experience the benefits of it. Let them participate in the outcomes it creates, share in the profits. And what you do then, and there's a client that we were working with that was looking at rolling out last mile infrastructure to some townships in Gauteng, and came up with such a wonderful model where there was local, for every 6 nodes that they built, there was 1 job created. There was collective ownership, and there's an entire financial ecosystem that's built around it that drives inclusivity. You can roll out education, you can do a whole lot of things. Now, if you apply a very conventional paradigm to assessing what risk looks like in relation to a fiber rollout through a spreadsheet sitting in another continent, you really don't get a good understanding. And because there may be a lack of data to actually tell you, that the risk is perhaps, I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but it looks different to what you think it looks like. And it can be mitigated or managed in a particular way. You are not going to be able to price that risk accordingly. So coming back to this concept of partnership, I think, that yes, they are the traditional sources of capital, but I think I want to also draw on a point that Hawk made, but maybe frame it in a different way. We all have a collective responsibility to improve the future because we're all vested in this, right? So the way we talk about Africa, the way we think about Africa, the way we behave around Africa will influence. It doesn't just come from a policy level, right? So we all have a collective responsibility for us as an African private sector. Where those information asymmetries exist, how do we close those? How do we, help provide that more granular detailed view about what is actually happening on the ground and what those risks look like and how they can be managed? So I think that's a really important part. What is a very unfortunate reality is the amount of capital flight that takes place out of the continent. Some of it, is the externalization of earnings, but some through unfortunate means, right? And I think that is something that is capital for which there is a good need in Africa. And I think what we really need to do is try and focus on how we curtail that. But one area where I think we perhaps, and maybe the doc will correct me, but at least insofar as what I've seen, I think hasn't been sufficiently explored is, what is the role of the African diaspora internationally in reversing the focus back into Africa from an economic development perspective? Now, if you have a look at what happens in many Asian countries, if you take India, if you take Pakistan, even if you take China, the diaspora has played a fundamentally critical role in the economic development of their homelands. And I think that is potentially one area, because people don't always leave because they don't want to come back, right? I think when you travel the world, you actually realize there's nothing better to be than African. And how do we create the mechanisms that allow for people who go out there to see, their impact on the development of the continent? So I think we need to change the way the traditional lending institutions price risk. I think we have an active role to play in, closing the data gaps, in the way we put our continent forward. And I think we've got to think of people as being always African the moment they leave, right? That just because you may live somewhere else doesn't mean you don't have an important role to play in shaping the future of the continent.
Okay, thank you. We will give an opportunity for people to ask questions, but before I do that, I think this issue of the risk profile has come up on both of you. And then you asked the question about the issue of Africa diaspora. Doc, you'd remember that when we're discussing this issue of the sovereign wealth funds, apparently in Rwanda, their sovereign wealth fund is funded by the diaspora. So that's a model perhaps that you can think of looking at. But in Rwanda, apparently it's based on the Rwandese outside and inside, but driven by that. Now, let me just give you a last chance to make your last remarks before we go for the questions or comments from the floor.
Yeah, so the issue of the diaspora, I think remittances, which is actually money coming from our citizens abroad, from the diaspora, they actually has surpassed overseas as official aid. The amount of remittances that coming into the continent is much bigger than the money that are being given in terms of overseas development aid.
Sure. So
that's a huge amount. But beside Rwanda, there's also the example of Ethiopia. The Renaissance Dam was actually largely financed through diaspora bonds. So there are innovative financing instruments, including diaspora bonds that we can use. We, as the ADB, we have been experimenting with a range of risk mitigating instruments. We have been engaged in what we call balance sheet optimization, but these are kind of jargons for people in
for economists,
for people in finance. We have been involved in things like local currency offering instead of borrowing money using forex. You can borrow using your own currency. What that does is you don't have the issues of exchange rate exposure and so forth.
I hope you're not going to make Trump angry with this whole idea.
No. Well, I will leave that to Ronald Ramola.
He might say that you are de-dollarizing.
I think the DECO will do a good job with Donald Trump. And you manage it pretty well. And securitizing remittances would be another element. So we can have a number of innovative instruments to try to do that. But the issue of sustainability, it's about thinking creatively, but it's also around issues of governance to make sure that resources are actually utilized optimally, and to cut down on things like leakages. You might not know. In fact, Africa loses, for example, in terms of illicit financial flows, close to, I think, about $90 billion annually. It's huge. So just closing that and things like invoice mispricing, base erosion and profit shifting. Okay, these are jargons in finance, but the essence is that we are losing from the resource sector quite a huge amount of money going out of the continent. And these are monies that we could put to good use. So if you are thinking 90 billion plus annually, yeah, it's way beyond the amount that is being given to Africa in overseas development assistance. Twice, actually, twice as big.
Sure.
So that's a huge amount. So, but that also requires that when you signing a contract for a mine in Zambia or a mine in Uganda or wherever, you need to have the correct agreements so that these kind of loopholes are actually dealt with. If you don't do it right, then you'll have a problem. Again, going back to our civil society colleagues who are here, your role would be to keep an eye on those agreements, because sometimes the people who are negotiating, either they play a blind eye or they are colluding. So if somebody is colluding at your expense, you might as well just hold them by the neck or something. So it is that important, by the way, actually. And so the role of civil society goes beyond just the accountability element, but you also have what I would call an intel role, because the research that you do. I was reading something, I think it was from IGD, or I saw a pamphlet over there somewhere, about something in West Africa. But that says a lot, that civil society has a role to keep an eye, which is intel, but also to bring to light things that might be happening wrong, and that will facilitate a social response to stop it. So the 90 billion plus in illicit financial flows is an example where civil society could play a very big role. Yeah.
Thank you so much. You can keep it. All right, colleagues, we have a few more minutes to engage with this discussion on the issue of reimagining partnerships and financing models for Africa's sustainable future. Now it's time for the questions. All right, I'm going to start with you, Sisi, at the back, and then come to you, Sisi, here, and then to you, Prof, or Doc. Okay, and then to you. And then we're going to take those, and then you're going to come into the second round. So we go there, here, and there. Thank you. Make it snappy and straight to the point.
Snappy and to the point, right? My question goes to Dr. George. You spoke about scalability and how you assess that, as part of suitability in terms of how you get involved. Now, in terms of financing models, how do institutions like the African Development Bank fare against Western countries that have common interests, in areas where there's large-scale infrastructure development and all kinds of projects where they can come in with $350 million one time at the highest scale and fund those? If we are looking at, what's the word I'm looking for, benefiting local engineers, business people, entrepreneurs to start being big players, in those same areas, how do you compete against keeping those projects from being, owned by foreign entities and staying within African entities when we cannot really compete on the scale that they can fund?
Okay, thank you. Let's come to the front here, my brother. Do we not have another roving mic close by? Okay. Okay, now that we have the mic, you can shoot your question.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Brian earlier on challenged us to imagine or reimagine some of the challenges we have with financing. He mentioned, for example, the Inga Dam. Now, I mean, he was suggesting that African countries, should be investing rather than relying on external funding. But the issue of risk comes in just like every other private business person would, you know. So how would you reimagine African governments actually financing a project like that? Thank you.
Thank you. In the meantime, can you send the mic to that guy, and then Sisi, you can go ahead.
Going back to the models that you've mentioned, Doug, I just wanted us perhaps maybe to look at some exploration around the mechanism that are required to de-risk African markets without reinforcing external dependency, particularly in the blended finance and climate funding. And also, again, furthermore to that, is how will that be measured from a success perspective in order for us to ensure that beyond capital mobilization, we are able to include a systematic approach that is resilient and strongly entrench the socio-economic transformation agenda.
Okay, all right. Judging by your look, you were looking at him, all right? Both, okay, yes, okay. Let's go to my brother there, and then we come and do the answers, and then go back to the floor.
Thank you. I think my question is to Dr. George. I think there's just been this consistent word or theme going around about these illicit flows within African in relation to the financing. I hear one of the suggestions maybe you're proposing is the civil society to be at the very forefront of holding governance accountable and responsible. From the African Bank side, given that one of the mandates, of course, is to find resources that will fund, development, economic and social development within Africa, what are sort of the direct involvement from African Bank that you guys are doing to ensure that, 9 billion is a lot of money that we... 90, oh geez, imagine.
Even worse.
That we find just flowing illicitly like that. What are sort of the intentional things? And maybe also just bringing in Mr. Jermaine there from the private element, and I hear there's the partnering element of that. How is maybe that knowledge in terms of what you within the private sector are doing, how is it transformed or transferred into the public sector so that this 90 billions every year is not seen flowing around without any use at all? Before we can speak about more money coming in. Thank you.
Thank you. Just in terms of, I'm going to give you now, just in terms of engagement, I have 5 minutes for this whole session, okay? So if I don't come to you, don't blame me. But I can ask the gentleman to please respond, be sharp, straight to the point, please. So that we can, yes, yeah.
On the issue of scale, so I started by saying we have been at the front of the conversation of scaling up, speed and scale. It's not just scale, speed and scale, because you also want the money to come around quite quickly. And one of the conversation around scale is the so-called Bridgetown Initiative. The Prime Minister of Barbados and all the others have been pushing very hard on that. And we hope that the AU joins that speed. And it's good that they are now at the table of the G20. So the reform of the global financial architecture is at the core of that. Now, we, at our level, we have experimented with a number of innovative financing instruments, diaspora bonds, green bonds. All of this is about scale. Issues around balance sheet optimization. All of these are actually attempts to actually leverage that, so that for every $1 that we have, we can mobilize maybe 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe 5 times. I think at this point, I think we probably do around 3 times for every single dollar that we have. And so the issue of scale remains an important one. But it also means that we need to support countries in stepping up domestic resource mobilization. The issue of without people taking over our assets and so on. So domestic resource mobilization will remain a critical one. On risk, we also experiment with a number of risk mitigation instruments, partial risk guarantees, issues around equities. There are a number of financing mechanisms that we have on the table. Like I said, I have a 10-page document here which was trying to list the kind of innovative financing instrument that we have. But we don't have the time to go one by one on them. But in the event that you want a copy, I can give it to you, the lady in the front. I don't think it's top secret. It's just a document which you can take a look at it. If you're a finance person, you probably have a good appreciation of what it is. Thanks.
Just before you give over to, there's a question that.
The question
it was about what you were talking about, civil society monitoring.
Oh, yeah,
What are you doing?
Yeah. Again, so the issue of capacity, the link between capacity of civil society, capacity of government to combat the issue of illicit financial flows. Some of it is actually, again, is linked to the issue of partnership, because asset recovery requires that countries to countries relationship works, right? So if I stole 100 million out of South Africa and ran away to DRC, the Congolese government should be able to earn back the assets to South Africa. In the event that there's no cooperation between those two entities, the money will be stuck in DRC. So it requires that countries also need to take responsibility to make sure that people don't steal stuff or illicitly bring stuff into their territory, and they keep it, because you are actually aiding and abetting, basically. But at our level, we have worked with governments in public financial management. We train people in ministry, in our projects at least, to make sure that the resources don't get lost. But these things are beyond the projects that we operate in. So,
okay, you're gonna have to summarize. I'm sorry to the people that have not asked questions yet. We just have to move on, please. Sorry about that.
Thank you, Program Director. And in the interest of time, I'll maybe just make a final comment to kind of, and it relates to the last question that was asked. And thank you for that question. And I think one of the big issues that, very often we come from a private sector and we talk about the role of the public sector, the role of civil society, and we sit there and we pretend we're not a part of it, right? I think it's really important that us as the private sector, I mean, if you look at a lot of the illicit, things that have taken place, we can't pretend that there was no private sector involvement, right? So we also have a role to play. So I think number one is that acknowledgement. It's very easy to sit and criticize everybody else. The private sector also has enabled it in certain instances. And being a member of the private sector, it's about how do we hold ourselves and each other to account, right? And to a higher level of integrity. Because, unfortunately, we will all feel the consequences of this going wrong. So similarly, we all have a role to play. So my response to that will be, for each one of us, no matter where we come from, it starts with us. So when I go back to the office, how do I hold my colleagues, my clients, the firms that we partner with to a higher level of integrity in terms of what we do?
Thank you, gentlemen. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you so much. I appreciate that you can take your seats. Thank you so much for enlightening us and getting really into the main issues here. Please accept my apologies, audience. I'm just doing as much as I can to make sure that everybody participate.